The warm June sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church, casting colorful shadows across the faces of eager wedding guests. 12-year-old Andy fidgeted with his bow tie, his stomach churning with anxiety as he watched his father, Robert, straighten his tuxedo in front of the altar mirror. The wedding was supposed to start in 30 minutes, but Andy knew he couldn't let it happen. For the past 8 months, Andy had watched his father fall deeply in love with Grace, a woman who seemed perfect on the surface. She had swept into their lives shortly after Andy's mother passed away from cancer, bringing home-cooked meals and a shoulder to cry on. Grace worked as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital, and her gentle demeanor had initially won Andy over too. But things changed 3 months ago when Andy started noticing strange patterns in Grace's behavior. It started with small inconsistencies in her stories about work. She would mention being on call during weekends when Andy had clearly seen her car parked at the shopping mall. Then there were the mysterious phone calls she would take in hushed tones, always stepping outside or into another room. The turning point came last week when Andy was helping his father organize some paperwork in the home office. While searching for an insurance document, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath a stack of wedding planning folders was a newspaper clipping from 2 years ago. The article detailed the mysterious death of an elderly patient at a hospital in the neighboring state, and the subsequent investigation of a nurse who had access to the patient's substantial fortune. The nurse's name wasn't Grace, but when Andy looked at the grainy photograph accompanying the article, he recognized those same dark eyes and the distinctive birthmark near her collarbone. The nurse had disappeared before the investigation could be completed, and the case remained unsolved. Andy spent the next week secretly gathering more evidence. He discovered that Grace had been using a different last name at her previous job, and through careful observation, he noticed she would sometimes slip and mention details about her past that contradicted her earlier stories. But what truly confirmed his suspicions was overhearing a late-night phone conversation where she discussed selling property that Andy knew belonged to his father. Now, standing in the church's antechamber, Andy clutched his phone tightly in his pocket. He had downloaded copies of the newspaper article and saved screenshots of Grace's inconsistent social media profiles under different names. His father deserved to know the truth, but Andy knew he had to handle this delicately. Robert had been through so much after losing Andy's mother, and this revelation would shatter him all over again. The wedding coordinator bustled past, clipboard in hand, announcing that the ceremony would begin in 20 minutes. Andy's heart raced as he watched Grace's bridesmaids fussing over her in a room down the hall. Through the partially open door, he could see her adjusting her veil, the perfect picture of an innocent bride. Taking a deep breath, Andy approached his father. "Dad, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's really important." Robert turned, his face glowing with happiness. "Can it wait until after the ceremony, buddy? We're about to start." Andy shook his head firmly. "No, Dad. It has to be now. Please." Something in his son's tone made Robert pause. He had never seen Andy look so serious. "Okay, son. What is it?" Robert led them to a quiet corner of the antechamber. Andy pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "There's something you need to see about Grace. She's not who she says she is." As he showed his father the evidence he had gathered, Robert's face transformed from confusion to disbelief, and finally to horror. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Robert whispered, his voice hoarse. Before Andy could respond, a commotion erupted from the bride's room. Grace's voice carried down the hall, unusually sharp and angry, as she argued with someone on her phone. The words, "transfer" and "accounts" drifted clearly to where they stood. Robert's face hardened as the pieces fell into place. Years of working in finance had taught him to recognize the signs of fraud, and now he was seeing them clearly in the woman he had almost married. He pulled out his own phone and dialed 911, his hand steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. As they waited for the police to arrive, Andy stood close to his father, offering silent support. The guests were still chattering happily in the main church, unaware of the drama unfolding in the antechamber. Grace's angry phone conversation had turned to hurried whispers, and they could hear her pacing in her room. "You saved me from making a terrible mistake," Robert said quietly, pulling Andy into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you for being brave enough to speak up." Andy hugged his father back, relief washing over him. He knew there would be difficult days ahead as they dealt with the aftermath of this revelation, but they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else since losing his mother. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the peaceful afternoon air, bringing with them the promise of justice and the end of Grace's deception. The wedding would never take place, but something more important had been preserved: the trust between a father and son, and the courage to stand up for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing police lights and shocked whispers. The wedding guests had filed out of the church in confusion after Robert's best man announced that the ceremony was cancelled due to an emergency. Now, as the evening sun cast long shadows across the church parking lot, Andy sat on the stone steps watching the police officers escort Grace to their patrol car. She looked nothing like the elegant bride of an hour ago. Her carefully styled hair had come undone, and her mascara had left dark streaks down her cheeks. As she passed Andy and Robert, she shot them a look of pure venom that made Andy instinctively move closer to his father. The beautiful wedding dress she'd chosen now seemed like just another part of her elaborate disguise. Detective Chen, a sharp-eyed woman with salt and pepper hair, had been interviewing them for the past hour. Her notebook was filled with details about Grace's suspicious behavior and the evidence Andy had gathered. "You're quite the detective yourself, young man," she said, giving Andy an approving nod. Not many adults would have picked up on these details, let alone documented them so carefully. Robert hadn't left Andy's side throughout the whole ordeal. He sat with his arm around his son's shoulders, his wedding ring finger still bare, a reminder of the ceremony that thankfully never happened. The catering van was pulling away from the church, and somewhere inside, the wedding coordinator was probably still trying to make sense of how everything had fallen apart so quickly. "We've been tracking similar cases across 3 states, Detective Chen explained, showing them a tablet with multiple case files. "Same pattern: she gets close to wealthy widowers, usually with children, gains their trust, and then disappears with their money. She's been operating under at least 5 different names that we know of." Andy felt his father stiffen beside him. "The life insurance money from my wife's death," Robert said quietly. "She knew about it. She'd been asking me to add her name to the account, saying it would be easier to manage household expenses after the wedding. That's typically her final move before disappearing," Detective Chen confirmed. "But thanks to Andy, she didn't get the chance this time. We've already frozen her known accounts, and we'll need both of you to come down to the station tomorrow to give formal statements." As the police car carrying Grace disappeared around the corner, Andy noticed his father's best friend Tom approaching with 2 cups of hot chocolate from the coffee shop across the street. Tom had been amazing throughout this whole situation, helping to handle the confused guests and making sure the media didn't get wind of the story yet. "Thought you two could use something sweet," Tom said, handing them the cups. "The church is all cleared out, and I've asked Father Patrick to keep this quiet for now. How are you holding up, Rob?" Robert took a long sip before answering. "Honestly, I feel like an idiot. All the signs were there, but I was so caught up in the idea of giving Andy a complete family again that I missed them completely." He turned to Andy, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm so sorry, son. I should have been more careful." Andy shook his head. "Dad, it's not your fault. She fooled a lot of people. Even I liked her at first, remember?" Detective Chen closed her notebook and stood up. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Mr. Patterson. These perpetrators are experts at manipulation. They know exactly what to say and do to gain trust. She handed Robert her card. We'll need you both at the station tomorrow at 10 a.m. Try to get some rest tonight. As they walked to their car, Andy noticed several wedding gifts still piled in the church entrance. The sight of them, wrapped in cheerful paper with ribbons and bows, made everything feel even more surreal. Tom promised to handle returning them to the guests. The drive home was quiet, both father and son lost in their thoughts. The house, when they arrived, still bore all the signs of wedding preparation. Grace's makeup bag sat on the kitchen counter, and her wedding planning binder was open on the coffee table. Robert walked through the rooms, methodically collecting her things and placing them in a box for the police. Andy helped, but he couldn't stop thinking about how close they'd come to disaster. As he gathered Grace's books from the living room shelf, a small notebook fell out. Inside were handwritten notes about his father's accounts, work schedule, and even notes about Andy's school routine. The systematic way she had studied their lives made him shudder. Later that night, as they sat eating pizza on the couch, their first meal together since discovering the truth, Robert turned to his son. "You know what today reminded me of?" he asked, picking off a mushroom. "That time when you were 7, and you insisted there was something wrong with our car's brakes. Everyone thought you were just making things up, but you kept insisting. Turned out you were right, the mechanic found a serious problem that could have caused an accident." Andy remembered that incident. "Mom always said I had good instincts." "She did," Robert smiled, though his eyes were misty. "She'd be so proud of you today, Andy. You protected our family, just like she always taught us to look out for each other." They stayed up late that night, talking more openly than they had in months. Robert shared stories about how he'd met Andy's mother in college, and Andy talked about his memories of her. They both agreed that while they missed her terribly, trying to replace her with someone else wasn't the answer. As Andy headed up to bed, exhausted but relieved, he paused on the stairs. "Dad? Are you going to be okay?" Robert looked up from where he was sorting through the wedding paperwork. "Yeah, buddy, I will be. It'll take some time, but we'll be okay. We've got each other, right?" "Right," Andy nodded, feeling stronger than he had in weeks. "And next time you start dating someone, maybe we should do a background check first?" His father's laugh, though tired, was genuine. "Definitely. And Andy? Thank you for being braver than I was today." As Andy lay in bed that night, he could hear his father moving around downstairs, probably still processing everything that had happened. Tomorrow they would have to deal with the police statements, the gossip, and all the aftermath of Grace's deception. But for now, knowing that his father was safe and that their family, small as it was, remained protected, Andy finally felt at peace. The police station buzzed with activity the next morning as Andy and his father made their way through security. Detective Chen met them in the lobby, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a hot chocolate for Andy. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd been working through the night, but her smile was warm as she led them to a comfortable conference room instead of the usual interrogation area. "We've made some significant discoveries since yesterday," she said, spreading out photographs and documents across the table. "Grace Williams, or should I say, Angela Morrison, has quite a history. We've linked her to similar cases in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan." Andy leaned forward, studying the photos. Each one showed Grace with different hair colors and styles, standing next to different men, all of them looking as happy and in love as his father had been. The sight made his stomach turn. "In the last 6 years, she's stolen approximately $2.8 million from various victims," Detective Chen continued. "She specifically targeted widowers with children, using her background as a nurse to appear caring and trustworthy. She even had fake credentials made for each new identity." Robert ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Andy recognized as a sign of stress. "How did she know about us? How did she choose our family?" Detective Chen pulled out a tablet and opened a social media page. She followed local obituary notices and support groups for widowers. Your wife's obituary mentioned your position at the bank, and Grace, or Angela, probably saw you as an ideal target. Andy felt a surge of anger. This woman had used their grief, had pretended to care about them when all she wanted was their money. He thought about all the times she'd helped him with homework or made his favorite dinner, wondering if every kind gesture had been calculated. "There's more," Detective Chen said, her expression grave. "After we arrested her, we executed a search warrant on a storage unit registered under one of her aliases. We found detailed files on at least 3 other potential targets in the area, all widowers with children, all financially secure." As they spent the next 2 hours giving their statements, more details of Grace's scheme emerged. She had already begun transferring small amounts from Robert's accounts to offshore banks, using her access to his computer when he was at work. The wedding was meant to be her final act. Once married, she planned to convince Robert to transfer his assets into joint accounts before disappearing with everything. "What I don't understand," Robert said, staring at the evidence spread before them, "is why she stayed so long. 8 months is a long time to maintain a deception." "The life insurance payout from your wife's death," Detective Chen explained gently. "She knew it was in a trust that couldn't be accessed until after your remarriage. She was playing the long game." Andy watched his father absorb this information, seeing the pain and anger flash across his face. But there was something else too: relief. Relief that they had discovered the truth before it was too late. During a break in their statements, Andy went to get some water from the hallway dispenser. He overheard 2 officers discussing how Grace had nearly escaped through the church's back entrance yesterday, but quick thinking from Officer Rodriguez had prevented her flight. The reality of how close they'd come to losing everything hit Andy hard. When he returned to the conference room, a victim advocate named Mrs. Thompson had joined them. She spoke softly about support groups for fraud victims and their families, handing Robert several brochures. "The emotional impact of this kind of betrayal can be as devastating as the financial one," she explained. "It's important to have support while you process everything." "I keep thinking about the other families," Andy said suddenly. "The ones in the photos. Did they get their money back?" Detective Chen's expression softened. "Some of it. We're still tracking down accounts and assets. But thanks to you stopping her when you did, we've frozen most of her recent transactions. The evidence you gathered will help build a strong case against her." As the day progressed, they learned more about Grace's background. She had once been a legitimate nurse, but her license had been revoked 10 years ago after suspicious patient deaths. Since then, she had created a network of false identities, moving from state to state, leaving broken families and empty bank accounts in her wake. By late afternoon, they were finally done giving their statements. As they walked to the parking lot, Robert received a call from the bank's fraud department. They had discovered attempts to access his accounts from an unknown device late last night, presumably one of Grace's accomplices trying to salvage what they could of the scheme. "We'll need to change all our passwords," Robert said after hanging up. "And the security company is coming tomorrow to change the locks, just in case." Andy nodded, then remembered something. "Dad, what about the honeymoon tickets? And the wedding venue deposit?" Robert managed a small smile. "Tom's handling the cancellations. He said to consider the lost deposits a small price to pay for dodging a bullet." He paused, looking at his son thoughtfully. "Maybe we should use those plane tickets ourselves, take a father-son trip instead. After all this is over." The idea lifted Andy's spirits. "Could we go to that science museum in Boston you promised to take me to last summer?" "Absolutely. But first, we need to deal with all this." Robert gestured at the police station behind them. Detective Chen said the case might take months to fully unravel. As they drove home, Andy noticed his father seemed less tense than yesterday. Talking about everything, understanding the full scope of Grace's deception, had somehow made it easier to accept. They weren't the first family she had targeted, but they would be the last, thanks to Andy's observation skills and courage to speak up. At home, they found several casseroles on their doorstep with notes from neighbors expressing their support. News of the cancelled wedding had spread, though the full story remained private for now. Their community had rallied around them, offering help in their own quiet ways. That evening, as they heated up one of the casseroles, Robert turned to Andy. "You know, your mother always said that bad things show us who our real friends are. I think she was right." Andy thought about Detective Chen's dedication, Tom's unwavering support, and their neighbor's kindness. Yeah, she usually was right about stuff like that. As they ate dinner, they began making plans for the future, changing their routines, setting up better security, and talking about that trip to Boston. The betrayal still hurt, but they were already beginning to heal, their bond stronger than ever. Later, as Andy got ready for bed, he found an old photo of his mom tucked into his mirror frame. Her smile seemed to hold a message: "You did good, kiddo. You protected our family." Andy touched the photo gently, knowing that wherever she was, she would be proud of how they had faced this crisis together. A week after the wedding that never was, Andy sat in the courthouse waiting area, nervously adjusting his tie. The preliminary hearing for Grace's case was about to begin, and the district attorney had asked him to testify about his discoveries. The hallway buzzed with quiet conversations as other fraud victims from different states arrived, each with their own story of betrayal. Detective Chen approached them, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "The other victims want to meet you, Andy," she said softly. "You're something of a hero to them. Your actions didn't just save your family, you helped us uncover evidence that will bring justice for everyone she hurt." Robert squeezed Andy's shoulder supportively as they followed Detective Chen to a private conference room. Inside, 3 men and their children waited, all victims of Grace's previous schemes. Andy recognized them from the police photographs, though they looked different now, older, wiser, but somehow lighter, as if the weight of uncertainty had been lifted from their shoulders. One of the victims, a former architect named David, stepped forward with his teenage daughter. "My Katie lost her college fund because of that woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't stopped her, other families would have suffered the same fate." Katie, who looked about 15, gave Andy a small smile. "Dad said you figured it out by noticing the little things that didn't add up. That's pretty impressive for a 12-year-old. The room filled with similar stories of loss and recovery. Each family had their own version of Grace's deception, different names she'd used, different stories she'd told, but always the same pattern of targeting vulnerable families and exploiting their grief. A court officer appeared at the door. "They're ready for the first testimony." Inside the courtroom, Grace sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the warm, caring woman who had almost become Andy's stepmother. She didn't turn around as Andy took the witness stand, but he could see her hands clenching and unclenching on the table. The district attorney, Mrs. Rivera, gently guided Andy through his testimony. He explained how he'd first noticed the inconsistencies in Grace's stories, discovered the newspaper article, and gathered evidence. His voice grew stronger as he described the moment he decided to speak up, knowing he had to protect his father. "And what made you suspicious initially?" Mrs. Rivera asked. Andy thought carefully before answering. "It was lots of little things. She would say she was working night shifts, but her nursing shoes never moved from the closet. She got nervous whenever Dad talked about combining their bank accounts after the wedding. And..." He paused, gathering courage. "She never looked at Mom's pictures on the wall. Everyone who visits our house usually comments on them because Mom had such a beautiful smile, but Grace always avoided looking at them." From his seat in the gallery, Robert wiped his eyes discreetly. The other victims nodded in recognition. They'd all experienced similar moments of doubt that they'd pushed aside, wanting to believe in second chances. During the cross-examination, Grace's defense attorney tried to suggest that Andy had misinterpreted innocent actions, that he was just a child resistant to his father's remarriage. But Andy remained calm, answering questions clearly and honestly, just as Detective Chen had coached him. "Isn't it possible," the defense attorney asked, "that you were simply jealous of your father's attention being divided?" Andy looked directly at the attorney. "I wanted Dad to be happy. We both missed Mom so much, and at first, I thought Grace could help us heal. But Mom always taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, and to speak up even if I was scared." The defense attorney had no response to that. During a break in the proceedings, Andy and Robert sat in the courthouse cafeteria with the other families. They shared stories not just of their losses, but of how they'd rebuilt their lives afterward. David's daughter Katie had earned a scholarship to make up for her lost college fund. Another victim's son had started a support group for children of fraud victims. "The hardest part," one of the men said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "wasn't losing the money. It was losing the ability to trust. How do you open your heart again after something like this?" Robert nodded in understanding. "I've been thinking about that a lot. But watching Andy through all this, seeing his courage and wisdom, it reminded me that there's still so much good in the world. We just have to be more careful about who we let into our lives." Detective Chen joined them, bringing news that made everyone sit up straighter. "We've traced some of the stolen money to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The forensic accountants think they can recover about 60% of the total amount." While the adults discussed legal details, Andy found himself talking with the other kids. They formed an unexpected bond, sharing their experiences of watching their parents fall prey to Grace's manipulation and the guilt they felt for not speaking up sooner. "My dad blamed himself for months," Katie told Andy quietly. "He could barely look at me, knowing my college fund was gone. But we got through it together. You're lucky you caught on before she could do real damage." As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Rivera gathered everyone to discuss the next steps in the case. Grace had been denied bail due to flight risk, and the trial would likely begin in 3 months. The evidence was strong, especially with Andy's documentation and testimony. On the drive home, Robert took a different route, one that passed by Andy's mother's favorite park. They stopped at the small lake where they used to feed ducks together as a family. "You know what I realized today?" Robert said, watching the sunset reflect off the water. "Your mother is still protecting us. She taught you to be observant, to trust your instincts, to speak up when something's wrong. Those lessons saved us." Andy skipped a stone across the lake's surface, watching it bounce 4 times before sinking. "Do you think we'll ever have a normal family again?" Robert put his arm around his son. "We already have a normal family. It might be small, just the 2 of us, but it's real and honest. That's worth more than any perfect-looking lie." They stayed at the park until the streetlights came on, talking about everything and nothing. Andy shared more details about the subtle signs he'd noticed in Grace's behavior, and Robert opened up about the red flags he'd ignored because he'd wanted so badly to believe in new beginnings. As they headed home, Andy felt a new sense of purpose. The other victims' stories had shown him that recovery was possible, that families could emerge stronger from betrayal. He and his father had a long road ahead, but they would walk it together, carrying his mother's lessons in their hearts. The autumn leaves were starting to turn when Detective Chen called with news that would change everything. 2 months had passed since the preliminary hearing, and life had begun settling into a new normal for Andy and his father. But that peaceful October morning brought revelations that would shake their world once again. "We've discovered a much larger network," Detective Chen explained, seated at their kitchen table with a thick folder of evidence. Grace wasn't working alone. She was part of an organized group targeting grieving families across the country. "Your case helped us uncover their entire operation." Andy, who had been doing homework at the counter, moved closer to listen. The detective spread out photographs showing elegant charity galas and support group meetings, all seemingly legitimate events that the criminals had used to identify potential victims. They called themselves the Comfort Coalition, Detective Chen continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. They posed as a support network for widowed parents, but it was all a front. They shared information about vulnerable families, tracked insurance payouts, and coordinated their approaches. Robert sat heavily in his chair, processing this information. All those support group meetings Grace encouraged me to attend, she was actually scouting for other targets? Exactly. But here's where Andy's intervention became crucial. Detective Chen pulled out a laptop and opened a series of financial records. When he exposed Grace, it triggered a panic among her associates. They made mistakes, left trails we could follow. We've identified 12 other operatives and potentially hundreds of victims. Andy felt a mix of horror and pride. His simple act of protecting his father had snowballed into something much bigger than he'd imagined. The detective explained that federal agencies were now involved, and Andy's testimony would be even more important than before. But that's not all, Detective Chen said, pulling out one final document. We found evidence that Grace, or Angela, whatever her real name is, had ties to that suspicious death in her previous hospital job. The case has been reopened. The implications of this news took time to sink in. Over the next few weeks, their lives became a whirlwind of meetings with federal agents, discussions with prosecutors, and preparation for what would now be a much larger trial. But amidst all this activity, something unexpected began to happen. Other children of fraud victims started reaching out to Andy through their parents. It began with emails and phone calls, then grew into a small online support group. Katie, the teenager they'd met at the courthouse, helped Andy set it up, making sure it was secure and properly monitored by their parents. It helps to talk to people who understand, Andy explained to his father one evening as they prepared dinner together, a new ritual they'd started to maintain normalcy. Amid the chaos. Everyone thinks fraud only hurts adults, but we kids feel it too. We watch our parents blame themselves, see them struggle to trust again. Robert paused in chopping vegetables, studying his son thoughtfully. You've grown so much through all this. Sometimes I forget you're only 12. Almost 13, Andy corrected with a small smile, then grew serious. Dad, some of the kids in the group, their parents are still really struggling. Could we maybe help them? You're good with financial stuff, and you're learning to trust again. That conversation led to Robert volunteering his expertise to help other victims rebuild their financial security. He started hosting workshops at the community center, teaching people how to protect themselves from fraud and rebuild their lives after betrayal. Andy would sometimes sit in, proud to see his father turning their painful experience into something positive. The district attorney's office kept them updated on the expanding case. Grace had started cooperating with investigators, hoping for a lighter sentence. Her information led to raids across 3 more states, each uncovering new victims and new perpetrators. One crisp fall afternoon, Andy received an unexpected visitor at school. Katie had driven down from her town to talk to his class about fraud awareness and the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong. She told Andy's story, with permission, and explained how his courage had helped expose a criminal enterprise. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't doing something big and dramatic, she told the attentive students. Sometimes it's just paying attention and being willing to ask questions when things don't add up. After her presentation, Andy's classmates looked at him with new respect. He'd been quiet about the whole situation at school, but now his experience was helping others learn important lessons about trust, observation, and courage. That evening, Andy found his father in the home office, surrounded by papers. Robert had been asked to testify as an expert witness about the financial aspects of the fraud scheme, using his banking background to help explain the complexity of the crimes to the jury. How do you feel about the trial next month? Andy asked, settling into the comfortable chair they'd kept from his mother's reading nook. Robert looked up from his notes. Nervous. But ready. You know what gives me strength? Seeing how many people we're helping. Every time I meet another family at the workshops, every story I hear about someone who recognized the warning signs because of what we shared, it makes it all worth it. They were interrupted by a call from Detective Chen. The investigation had uncovered new evidence about the hospital death from Grace's nursing days. The family of the deceased patient wanted to meet Andy and thank him personally. His actions had reopened a case they'd thought would never be solved. It's like ripples in a pond, Robert said after they hung up. One small action can spread out and affect so many lives. Your mother used to say that all the time, remember? Andy nodded, remembering how she'd taught him about consequences and responsibility. He wondered what she would think of everything that had happened, how her lessons had helped him protect not just their family, but countless others. Later that night, Andy updated his journal, something his counselor had suggested to help process everything. He wrote about the expanding investigation, the support group, and his father's workshops. But mostly, he wrote about hope. Hope for justice, hope for healing, and hope for all the families learning to trust again. As he got ready for bed, Andy heard his father on the phone with Tom, discussing plans for a community fraud awareness event. The past few months had changed them both, but not in the way Grace and her criminal partners had intended. Instead of being destroyed by betrayal, they'd grown stronger, wiser, and more determined to help others. Through his bedroom window, Andy could see the harvest moon rising over their neighborhood. Somewhere out there, other families were healing, other children were finding their voices, and other parents were learning to trust again. All because he'd paid attention to the little things that didn't add up, and found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. The federal courthouse loomed before them on the first day of the trial, its stone columns casting long shadows in the morning light. Andy clutched his father's hand as they climbed the steps, joining a stream of other families affected by the Comfort Coalition's schemes. News vans lined the street, but federal marshals kept the reporters at a respectful distance. Inside, the building buzzed with quiet intensity. The main courtroom was packed with victims' families, law enforcement officers, and legal teams. Andy spotted Katie and her father in the front row, and several members of his online support group scattered throughout the gallery. They exchanged silent nods of encouragement. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Harrison entered the courtroom. The proceedings began with opening statements that painted a picture far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. The prosecution described a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade, targeting hundreds of grieving families across the country. This case began with the extraordinary awareness of a 12-year-old boy, the prosecutor began, gesturing toward Andy. His attention to detail and courage to speak up unraveled a criminal network that had eluded law enforcement for years. But more importantly, it gave other victims the courage to come forward. Grace sat at the defense table with 5 other accused members of the Comfort Coalition. She wore a plain navy suit instead of her usual elegant attire, her face set in a mask of indifference. But Andy noticed how she flinched slightly when the prosecutor mentioned the elderly patient's death at her former hospital. The evidence presentation began with Andy's original discoveries, the newspaper clipping, the inconsistent work stories, the suspicious phone calls. Detective Chen testified about how these clues led to the broader investigation, presenting financial records, fake identities, and surveillance footage that revealed the coalition's elaborate operation. During a break in proceedings, Andy and Robert found themselves in a quiet corridor with other families. A small group of children around Andy's age approached him shyly. They were all children of victims, some from cases dating back several years. "My dad lost everything to them 3 years ago," a quiet boy named Jack shared. "When we saw your story on the news, he finally stopped blaming himself. You helped him understand that these people were professionals at deception." Robert's testimony came after lunch. He explained how his banking experience helped him recognize the sophisticated nature of the fraud once Andy had opened his eyes to it. His voice remained steady as he detailed the psychological manipulation that had nearly cost him his life savings and his family's security. "They didn't just steal money," Robert testified. "They stole people's ability to trust, to hope, to believe in second chances. But thanks to my son, we're all here today, turning that story around." The most powerful moment came when Mrs. Rivera, the lead prosecutor, presented evidence of the coalition's internal communications. Emails and text messages revealed how they had systematically targeted grieving families, sharing information about insurance policies, assets, and children who might pose obstacles to their schemes. They called it emotional profiling, Detective Chin explained on the stand. They studied how different people process grief, then used that knowledge to manipulate their victims. They even had a ranking system for potential targets based on emotional vulnerability. As disturbing as these revelations were, they served to unite the victims even more strongly. During another recess, Andy overheard parents exchanging contact information, planning support meetings, and discussing ways to help other families avoid similar traps. Katie's father had organized a lunch delivery for all the families attending the trial. As they ate together in a reserved conference room, Andy realized that something remarkable had emerged from all this pain, a community of people determined to help each other heal. "You know what's amazing?" Katie said, sitting next to Andy with her sandwich. "A few months ago, we were all isolated in our shame and hurt. Now look at us, we're like one big support system." The afternoon session brought testimony from a former coalition member who had turned state's evidence. She described how the organization had evolved from simple romance scams to targeting grieving families, considering them more emotionally vulnerable and likely to have substantial insurance payouts. "We had protocols," the witness testified. "Ways to integrate ourselves into their lives, gain their trust, become indispensable. But nothing in our playbook prepared us for a child who could see through it all." Andy felt his father's arm tighten around his shoulders at these words. They sat together, listening as more details of the coalition's operations came to light. The organization had maintained fake charities, support groups, and even a network of references who would vouch for their false identities. Late in the afternoon, the prosecution presented evidence about the elderly patient's death that had first caught Andy's attention in the newspaper clipping. Medical records, witness statements, and financial documents painted a clear picture of premeditated fraud that had escalated to something much darker. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Rivera announced as the day drew to a close, "we'll hear from the victims' family members, including several children who were directly impacted by the coalition's crimes." Outside the courthouse, as the sun set behind the city skyline, families lingered in small groups, processing the day's revelations. Andy's online support group decided to meet in person, gathering in a nearby park where the younger children could play while the teens talked. "I used to think I was alone in this," a girl named Amy admitted. "Like no one could understand how it felt to watch someone try to steal your parent. But being here today, seeing all of us together, it's different now." Robert had joined a group of parents discussing ways to channel their experiences into positive change. They were planning educational programs for schools, support services for grief groups, and financial literacy workshops for families in transition. "We can't change what happened," Robert told them, "but we can change what happens next. We can help other families protect themselves." On the drive home, Andy was quieter than usual, processing everything he'd heard. The scope of what he'd helped uncover still felt overwhelming sometimes. "You okay, buddy?" Robert asked, glancing at his son. "Yeah," Andy nodded slowly. "It's just, when I showed you that newspaper article about Grace, I was just trying to protect our family. I never imagined it would help so many other people." "That's how positive change often happens," Robert replied. "One person notices something wrong and speaks up. Then others find their courage too." As they pulled into their driveway, Andy saw Mrs. Thompson, the victim advocate, waiting for them. She held a stack of letters, messages of support from other families across the country who couldn't attend the trial in person but wanted to share their stories of recovery and gratitude. That night, as Andy read through the letters in his room, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring more difficult testimony, more painful revelations, but also more healing, more connections, more proof that speaking up could change lives in ways he never expected. The second day of the trial brought unexpected challenges as the defense team launched their strategy. They attempted to paint the Comfort Coalition as a legitimate support organization that had been infiltrated by a few bad actors. But the morning's testimony would shatter that narrative completely. The day began with a surprise witness, a former IT specialist for the coalition who had maintained their secure communications network. He had turned himself in after seeing news coverage of Andy's story, bringing with him a treasure trove of digital evidence stored on encrypted servers. They documented everything, he testified, his voice trembling with remorse. Every target, every technique, every dollar stolen. They treated it like a business, complete with quarterly goals and performance reviews. The courtroom screens displayed internal newsletters where coalition members shared success stories, detailed accounts of how they had manipulated grieving families. Andy felt sick as he recognized some of Grace's techniques in these clinical descriptions of emotional exploitation. During a brief recess, Detective Chen pulled Andy and Robert aside to share some news. The evidence from those servers has helped us locate nearly $12 million in hidden assets, she explained. We're already working on the process to return funds to the victims. Andy noticed how several of the coalition members shifted uncomfortably in their seats when this information was presented. Grace, however, maintained her composed facade, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the defense table. The afternoon brought testimony from Dr. Powell, a psychologist specializing in grief counseling. She explained how the coalition had perverted legitimate therapeutic techniques to manipulate their victims. They used their understanding of the grieving process as a weapon, she testified. They knew exactly when people were most vulnerable and how to exploit that vulnerability. What made her testimony particularly powerful was her analysis of the support group Andy had helped create. What these young people have done, she explained, gesturing to where Andy and his friends sat, is remarkable. They've transformed a story of exploitation into one of healing and empowerment. The defense attorneys tried to cross-examine Andy again, this time suggesting that his mother's death had made him overly suspicious of anyone trying to join his family. But Andy's response silenced the courtroom. I didn't speak up because I was suspicious, he said clearly. I spoke up because my mom taught me that love means protecting the people you care about. Real love doesn't need to hide behind lies. During the lunch break, Andy found himself surrounded by reporters in the courthouse cafeteria, but Katie and several other kids from the support group formed a protective circle around him. They'd become like a family of their own, each understanding exactly what the others had been through. We're trend analysis experts now, Katie joked, trying to lighten the mood. Nobody's going to be able to fool our parents again, we've all got built-in fraud detectors after this. The afternoon session revealed another shocking dimension of the case. The coalition had maintained detailed psychological profiles of their victims' children, analyzing which ones might pose threats to their schemes. Andy's name appeared in their files with a warning, unusually observant, requires additional manipulation or removal from home environment. Robert's face went pale when this evidence was presented. The coalition had been discussing ways to convince him to send Andy to boarding school after the wedding. The depth of their manipulation seemed bottomless. But the most powerful moment came when the elderly patient's granddaughter testified about her grandfather's suspicious death at the hospital where Grace had worked. She was close to tears as she turned to Andy in the gallery. You didn't just save your father, she said. You helped us finally understand what happened to my grandfather. Our family can have closure now. As the day's proceedings wound down, Mrs. Rivera presented evidence of how the coalition had begun targeting retirement communities and elder care facilities before shifting focus to widowed parents. Their operations had grown more sophisticated over time, but they had also grown more reckless, leaving the trail of evidence that Andy had first discovered. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters had gathered, people who had heard about the case and wanted to show solidarity with the victims. Some held signs reading, "Truth Tellers," and "Kids Against Fraud," having been inspired by Andy's story. That evening, Robert hosted an impromptu dinner at their house for several families who had traveled from out of state for the trial. As pizzas were shared and stories exchanged, Andy realized that their home, which had felt so empty after his mother's death and so false during Grace's deception, was now filled with genuine warmth and friendship. "Your mom would love this," Robert told Andy quietly as they watched their guests interact. "She always said a house needs to be full of real love, not just pretty furniture and perfect appearances." Later, Andy found himself sitting on the back porch with Katie and some other teens from the support group. They were discussing plans to create a website where kids could share their experiences and warning signs they'd noticed, helping others trust their instincts. "You know what's weird?" Jack said, playing with his phone. "Before all this, I used to think being brave meant doing something big and dramatic. But sometimes it's just about paying attention and saying something when things don't feel right." The conversation was interrupted by Detective Chen, who arrived with updates about the case. The coalition's digital records had led to investigations in 3 other countries, revealing an international network of fraud operations targeting grieving families. "This is bigger than any of us imagined," she told them. "But that's what happens when people start speaking their truth, it gives others the courage to come forward too." As the evening wound down and families began heading to their hotels, Andy helped his father clean up the kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, both processing the day's revelations. "Dad?" Andy said finally, loading the last plate into the dishwasher. "Do you think we'll ever know why they did it? How they could hurt so many people?" Robert paused, considering the question carefully. "Some people see other people's pain as an opportunity for profit," he said slowly. "But what matters more is how we respond to that pain, whether we let it break us or use it to help others heal." That night, Andy added another entry to his journal. He wrote about the evidence, the testimonies, and the growing community of survivors. But mostly, he wrote about hope that their story would help other families trust their instincts, speak their truth, and find their way back to genuine love and trust. The verdict came down on a bright winter morning, 3 weeks after the trial began. Snow dusted the courthouse steps as families gathered, holding hands and sharing nervous glances. Andy sat between his father and Katie's family, his heart racing as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver the decision that would affect hundreds of lives. In the case of the United States versus Angela Morrison, also known as Grace Williams, and other members of the Comfort Coalition, Judge Harrison began, her voice clear and steady, "This court finds the defendants guilty on all counts." A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom. Grace and her co-defendants showed little reaction as the judge detailed their sentences, 15 to 25 years for each of them, plus mandatory restitution to their victims. The sophisticated nature of their scheme and the targeting of vulnerable families had led to enhanced penalties. Furthermore, the judge continued, "This court wants to acknowledge the extraordinary courage of Andrew Patterson, whose actions brought this criminal enterprise to light. His testimony reminds us that justice often begins with one person willing to speak the truth." After the proceedings, the courthouse steps became the scene of an impromptu celebration. Families hugged, cried, and shared their relief. News cameras captured the moment, but stayed respectfully distant, understanding that this was a private victory for those who had lived through the betrayal. Detective Chen approached Andy with a thick manila envelope. "Remember those assets we froze?" she said, smiling. "The first restitution payments will be going out next week. Many families will get back at least 70% of what they lost. But the financial recovery was only part of the story. The trial had created something more valuable, a network of support that would last long after the legal proceedings ended. Robert's fraud awareness workshops had expanded to multiple cities, and Katie's father had started a foundation to help victims rebuild their lives. "Your mom would be so proud," Robert told Andy as they drove home from the courthouse. "Not just of what you did, but of who you've become through all this." Andy thought about the journal entries he'd been writing throughout the trial. "You know what's funny, Dad? When I first found that newspaper article about Grace, I was scared to tell you. I thought you might not believe me. But you told me anyway," Robert said softly. "Because Mom always said that real love means telling the truth, even when it's hard." Andy looked out at the snowy streets. "I think I understand that better now." At home, they found their front yard filled with yellow roses, his mother's favorite flower. Neighbors had arranged this surprise, their way of showing support on this important day. Among the flowers was a card signed by dozens of community members who had followed their story. That evening, they hosted one final gathering for the families who had been part of the trial. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter, so different from the tense silence that had filled it during Grace's time there. Andy's support group members gathered in the living room, planning the launch of their website designed to help other kids trust their instincts and protect their families. "We're calling it Truth Tellers," Katie announced, showing them the prototype on her laptop. "It's got resources, warning signs to watch for, and a moderated forum where kids can share their experiences." The adult conversations in the kitchen centered around healing and moving forward. Some families had already started dating again, this time with healthy boundaries and greater awareness. Others were focusing on rebuilding their lives as single-parent households, finding strength in their completeness rather than seeking to fill an absence. "The hardest part of healing," Robert shared with the group, "is learning to trust again without letting fear control you. But watching these kids support each other, seeing how they've turned their pain into purpose, it gives me hope." Detective Chen arrived later with news that would bring their story full circle. The elderly patient's death from Grace's nursing days had been officially ruled a homicide, and charges would be filed. The family would finally have justice, all because of a newspaper clipping that had caught a 12-year-old's attention. As the evening wound down, Andy found himself sitting on the back porch with his father, just like they used to do with his mom. The winter air was crisp, but neither minded the cold. "Dad?" Andy asked, watching his breath form clouds in the air. "Do you think we'll ever have a bigger family again?" Robert considered the question carefully. "I think we already do have a bigger family," he said, gesturing toward the house full of friends. "It's just not the kind we expected. And if someday we decide to add to it, we'll do it together, with our eyes wide open." Inside, they could hear Katie leading a workshop for younger kids, teaching them about digital safety and the importance of trusting their instincts. The foundation she and her father had started would be funding similar programs in schools across the country. The next morning, Andy woke early and went to his mother's favorite park. The lake was frozen, the trees dusted with snow, and the rising sun painted everything in soft gold. He sat on their usual bench, feeling closer to her than he had in months. "I did it, Mom," he whispered. "I protected our family, just like you taught me." A gentle breeze stirred the snow from the trees, and for a moment, Andy felt wrapped in the same warm certainty he used to feel when his mother hugged him. He understood now that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about honoring it by living truthfully and helping others do the same. Back home, Robert was preparing for another fraud awareness workshop. The local senior center had requested a session after hearing about the coalition's attempts to target retirement communities. Andy would be joining him as a speaker for the first time. "Ready for this?" Robert asked as they gathered their materials. Andy nodded, thinking about all the families they'd helped and all the ones they might still help. "Ready," he said. Someone needs to teach people that real love doesn't need fancy stories or perfect timing. It just needs to be true. As they drove to the senior center, Andy's phone buzzed with messages from the support group. The Truth Teller's website had already received dozens of messages from kids sharing their stories and asking for guidance. What had started as one boy's effort to protect his father had grown into a movement, helping families across the country protect themselves from those who would exploit their grief. The story of the boy who halted his father's wedding didn't end with a dramatic ceremony or a perfect new family. Instead, it ended with something better: truth, healing, and a different kind of love story. One about a father and son who learned that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of life come after the hardest ones, and that the best families are built on honesty, even when that honesty hurts at first. They had emerged from their darkest moment not just survivors, but teachers, helping others find their way back to trust and hope. And in doing so, they had honored the most important lesson Andy's mother had ever taught them, that love, real love, always begins with truth.